We're arriving here on the heels of a devastating election in the U.S. For those of us who fight for more equitable, inclusive, and open cities in the U.S., the narratives and actions coming out of Washington, D.C. over the last few months, and particularly in the last few days, represent the most hideous convergence of exclusionary political and economic agendas than I've ever seen in my lifetime. Yesterday, the U.S. President issued an executive order committing federal funds to the construction of a border wall that would stretch the entire continental length of the southern border of the United States with Mexico. And as an added insult, he canceled a pending meeting with the Mexican president, claiming that Mexico needs to be fair with the U.S., that Mexico needs to respect the U.S. by itself paying for the construction of this wall. And if they weren't willing to do that, there was no sense in even talking, and that the U.S. would be taking another route. And by that other route, of course, the president is implying that he will slap a 20% tax, an import tax, on Mexican goods, which will effectively place the burden of the wall on the Mexican public. So this is the border wall between Tijuana and San Diego, between Mexico and the U.S. Teddy and I live and work in this territory. It's a zone of conflict that divides, obviously, not only two cities, but two countries, and indeed two continents. This provocative territory is a site of dramatic inequality, and it sits just 30 minutes south of our campus, the University of California, San Diego, and just minutes away from San Diego's mega wealthy suburban paradise. One of the wealthiest zip codes in the United States sits just a few miles from the border. This region where we live and work is both the largest binational metropolitan region in the world, with more international border crossings than any other checkpoint on the planet. And it's also a microcosm of all of the deprivations that globalization has inflicted on the world's most vulnerable demographics: global poverty, global migration, global neoliberalization, global trade, global justice. And in our region, these dynamics are given their own special sensibility by two geopolitical institutions. First, and I'm sure you've heard a lot about this in the news recently, the NAFTA treaty, the North American Free Trade Agreement. It's kind of a double-edged sword because on the one hand, it brought jobs to Mexico. But on the other hand, it encourages factories, multinationals, to set up maquiladoras, factories on the periphery of Tijuana, where they generate massive profits freed from any restriction on labor practices, environmental protection, or urban zoning regulation. So they're entirely unregulated. And second, this aggressively militarized political border, this physical structure that cuts across and radically disrupts the social, economic, and environmental ecologies that situate life for people in this region. And I would say there's a third institution as well, and those are the walls and the barriers that are built psychically over time through the discourse and narratives that come from our political leadership and the fear that it generates among publics in the U.S. Now, before we get into our work in this region, we just wanted to say a little bit about our practice. Teddy and I have been working together on projects in this region that link universities, community organizations, and the municipalities on both sides of the border. We direct a center on the campus called the Cross-Border Initiative, which really resonates in many ways with the Metrolab project here in Brussels. We too are attempting to create a space for cross-disciplinary problem solving. And for me, as a social scientist, this kind of work has been almost cleansed out of academic social science. Social science, is very good at measuring and quantifying and so forth, and being evaluated for how well you measure and quantify. But the social sciences have really lost their way with regard to real-world problem solving. It's tended to be pushed out of social science as a kind of vulgar public policy or diplomacy. This is not what real scientists do. So we're trying to create a space where social scientists can actually learn how to problem solve in collaboration with the more practical disciplines on our campus: architecture, engineering, oceanography, other practical disciplines. We're also really eager to challenge an assumption within universities that working with marginalized communities is a vertical activity, that the universities solve everything on the campus, and that they come and they find a site and they descend down and test what they know in a real setting, as if the world is kind of our petri dish. We've been trying very hard to move the relationship between universities and communities from a vertical one to a horizontal one, where the university and the community are working together collaboratively to solve problems, with the assumption that the university researcher needs the knowledge of communities as much as the community needs us. So there's a kind of reciprocal knowledge production that's been very important to what we do. The last thing I want to say about our practice is that while we're clearly interested in advancing concrete projects on the ground, we're also interested in understanding and breaking apart the elements of the process that's necessary to do that. So we do a lot of work on visualizing process, creating process maps that can then provide resources and tools for others who are interested in doing this kind of work. Now, all the projects that we do, and what really holds us together as an architect, urbanist, and a political theorist, it's a thread that we're going to explore in a variety of ways. We, Teddy as an urbanist, me as a social scientist, have both been interested in what we might call the informal social, moral, economic, and urban dynamics, and the interplay of these things. So social, moral, economic, and urban. For decades now, I've been interested in the emergence or the informal evolution of beliefs, norms, and collective behavioral patterns among people who share space. How reciprocal expectations generate informal patterns of collective and urban behavior, and the way spatial conditions constrain and enable these processes. So I'm interested in informal social dynamics. Teddy is interested in informal urbanization and economic flows, particularly how people in conditions of scarcity, on the margins of formal institutions, build informal settlements, markets of exchange, and general strategies of collective survival. And obviously, this bottom-up phenomena have exploded in recent years of global economic boom, with accelerating global migratory patterns and urbanization of the world's population, producing unprecedented informality and slums on the margins of global cities everywhere. So in short, our work is a convergence of the social and the built, and the interplay between them. And we've also been keenly interested in mediating or curating relations between this bottom-up informal knowledge and capacity with formal institutions like municipalities, universities, other cultural institutions. In the sense we see ourselves as urban curators, mediating top-down and bottom-up dynamics.
I think continuing with this introduction to definitely very broad issues, we would like to share a few anecdotes and sort of bits and pieces of a process that has evolved as our practice obviously has transformed in the last decades, occupying this very contested binational and border territory. So opening the question of what is the role of the architect, obviously, today in confronting unprecedented crisis. A few weeks before the election, in fact, we got a call from a foundation from New York City, the Third Mind Foundation, inviting Fonna and me to be jurors for this international competition, an architecture international competition, to design, in fact, the new border wall between U.S. and Mexico, in case Donald Trump would be elected. Obviously, at that moment, we were still in heaven, thinking that that would never happen. But what is interesting is that, we looked at the brief. We obviously rejected the invitation, but it was interesting to really look at the language that the architects, curators, and cultural producers of this exhibition had assembled to summon others, other designers. So they finished their brief by saying, let us be clear, we take no position on this issue. We remain politically neutral. And we thought, obviously for a moment, that that's exactly the problem with our institutions today, in fact, with many of us as practitioners. To remain politically neutral in the context of unprecedented social, economic, cultural inequalities is to be complicit, we said to ourselves, is to be complicit with the institutions that have perpetuated what is morally and ethically wrong. And we wanted to begin by suggesting that this is one of the fundamental aspects today for all of us. How do we need to take a position that in fact inequality is wrong, that xenophobia is wrong, and that building border walls is wrong? And I think even though for many of you might be commonsensical, I think very seldom institutions have the guts, how would you call it, the courage to say it out loud, I think. This political neutrality is what really undermines our discourse. And I think this is part of an incapacity, and we are teachers, so we see it constantly, not only in our students and our professions, our incapacity to think socially and politically when we come to, in terms of issues of design. And obviously, it's a natural outcome of decades that have been defined by agendas that are antisocial and obviously anti-public. That agendas that have decimated, that have eroded, in fact, our collective social, environmental, and economic assets. And as we all know by now, have produced equally unprecedented urban asymmetry everywhere. Unprecedented social and economic inequality. So for us, I think the topic begins by confronting this very issue, confronting inequality as a cultural crisis. Obviously, we know that it's economic, that it's environmental, but at the very, very base, sort of, in a fundamental way, is a cultural crisis, which for Fonna and I means a crisis of the institutions, unable to reimagine themselves, unable to come up with different arrangements, different protocols, let's say, to confront head-on the mechanisms that have produced such unprecedented inequality. So we as artists and as architects, I think we need to begin by exposing the conditions themselves that have produced the crisis, because those conditions, the logic, the knowledge of that institution, of those institutional mechanisms, should become the material for the contemporary designer. This is what we've told ourselves and obviously others. So we need to visualize inequality. Obviously, Fonna also suggested that as we try to re-engage a public imagination and re-engage the public at large, we need to also be curators of new forms of visualization that enable communities to have access to the complexity of urbanization and of the political, ultimately. So we cannot think of other people in recent times that have been able to visualize inequality in such a way as Emmanuel Saez and Thomas Piketty. Many of you know about this research, political economists who have been able to produce one of the most exciting histories of wealth and income and taxation and the redistribution of wealth by compressing that huge research in two lines that come in contact with each other, that dance dialectically. And we visualize this very briefly. Two lines that move across time, stretch and bend through times, through time, two peaks at both ends and a valley in the middle, and the line below mirrors the same topography of the top line. For many of you, probably already know where we are getting here. We know that those two peaks are very definitely legible for all of us. The peak to the left is moments, obviously, in American history, and for that matter of the world, where we find the largest income inequality. Obviously, 1926, pertaining to the Great Economic Depression of the late 20s, and our own economic downturn in 2006 and 2008. But what is fundamental about the work of these political economists is that the line below revealed that at those two very moments, we also find the lowest taxation on the wealthy. This is the drama of this statistical, this study. So for us, really, this means that this gap visualizes the crisis itself, because it suggests that at those very moments we have the detachment, the withdrawal of institutions from their social commitments. And also for us particularly, again, this is a very much a vantage from the United States, but I'm sorry to say that that's now part of Europe's own dilemma, is that this renders visual the hypocrisy of a trickle-down economic model that has somehow continues to capture the imaginary of many Americans. If we detax the wealthy, all of us will be equally as wealthy one day. So this very strange notion of the American dream, which has become definitely a public nightmare, because it has consolidated a very individualistic agenda that has moved our collective resources from the many to the very few. We all know about these things, I hope. I'm sure we were just trying to be dramatic to begin with, because that's a reality. But for us, what has been surprising, and out of this study, is that we very seldom talk about the valley between those two peaks. What happened in those decades where those two lines came closer to each other, which meant, obviously, a more equitable distribution of resources. The recuperation of institutional memory of those decades is at stake today, and this is what Mildred was saying. Who is going to do this? Who are the interlocutors of institutional memory that can rescue the traces of a more civic and public sensibility? Obviously, we are referring to the decades of the New Deal in the United States, when FDR mobilizes not only government, but private institutions, civic philanthropy, universities, and communities to come together, not in an austerity agenda, as we are here talking about everywhere from the US to Europe, but in fact to together invest in unprecedented ways in public infrastructure, public education, public art, public housing, public health. And obviously, we know that during those decades, there was a lot of oppression as well. There was a lot of racism. There was a lot of segregation. So it's not to say that those were rosy years, but nevertheless, policies were organized around public thinking, public sensibilities. Where is the public today is one of our fundamental questions. And obviously, this research shows how the pendulum between the private and the public moves across history to define our cities. Moments in history where the city is dominated by private interest, and moments, obviously, where infrastructure and other investments are organized around public spending. For us, then, inequality, as there are many definitions of it. One of them is inequality emerges out of the polarization, radical polarization between private and public interest. And guess what? At this moment, we are not looking at all at our valley yet.
It's getting worse. January 20th brought about a dramatic reaffirmation of privatization and trickle-down fallacies, combined with all of the bundle that's coming along with it: unbridled racism, xenophobia, isolationist militarism, law and order as a response to urban conflict. Witnessing this next wave of assaults in the U.S. on our public institutions is going to be excruciating. We've entered a kind of fact-free Orwellian realm where a climate change denier will run the Environmental Protection Agency in the United States, where institutions, important long-standing commitments in institutions like the U.S. Department of Education will be dismantled. We'll witness unprecedented tax cuts for the wealthy, of course, and unprecedented dismantling of the social safety net, which began as the first executive order of the White House. It'll also be a period of dramatic closure, which inspired the title of our talk today. A kind of patriotic withdrawal from international cooperation to regain our national sovereignty, our greatness, emblematized, of course, by the hardening of the border wall between U.S. and Mexico. And, all of these dynamics obviously resonate differently in different parts of the country. And for us at the border region, there's an incredible sense of anxiety and urgency in the air. People are genuinely afraid. My 11-year-old son came home in tears the other day, crying for his friend Miguel and their family, and asking if we could hide them in our basement. Now, as a family of Holocaust survivors, today is Holocaust Remembrance Day, hearing those words from my son it's just chilling. But that's where we are in this part of the world right now. So thinking about grand responses in some ways is not as urgent as protection right now of people, of demographics that are vulnerable to political reprisal and social reprisal. So our first agenda right now is to devise systems of protection, very urgent systems of protection to protect the vulnerable. A very encouraging movement in the United States right now is the development of sanctuary cities and sanctuary institutions who are declaring that they will resist any federal attempt to violate the human rights and dignity of people within their boundaries. And if this holds true, and we believe it will, we envision pretty intense conflict in the coming years between many U.S. cities and the federal government. And it may be the kind of conflict that our country needs desperately right now.
Okay. As many of you might know, the San Diego-Tijuana border region is one of those geographies of conflict where marginalization is physicalized, where U.S. investment in surveillance and control infrastructure boldly exposes the commitment to exclusion, exacerbating us versus them, and instigating a climate of protectionism and border hysteria that has gripped geopolitics across the globe, from the victory of Donald Trump in the US to Fortress Europe to Brexit. So that's the reason I was saying I wish that this was just an American story. I'm sorry to say you are also part of this horrible period. This is, in fact, this wall is the object that in the last US elections is where many Americans projected their collective fear of the other, becoming the lens through which immigrant communities were yet once more criminalized. And I'm thinking that for many of us living in this region, obviously, we've been hearing this every single week since the campaign process over the last year, that the border region and the border itself was yet another site of criminalization and polarization. But for some of us living exactly at that juncture, that border region, we have declared it, in fact, a place of creativity, a place where a new political leadership might emerge that really reaches out beyond that jurisdictional boundary to construct new strategies of interdependence. I think this is a fundamental paradigm that we would like to engage. Can border regions be laboratories of interdependence, where two cities that are divided can really collaborate in constructing their own destiny? So here is, in this region, as Fonna mentioned earlier, the largest binational metropolitan region in the world, the most trafficked checkpoint in the world, is also a testing ground for the whole idea that urban conflict can really begin to be an operational tool, a creative tool. The exposition, the exposure, the visualization of conflict is fundamental in our work. So this is the region, and you can see on the left-hand side, two little figures. Those are the two neighborhoods that we've been working with during the last decades through our work. In that sense, as a couple of you presented, you presented this morning, Miodrag, and the whole idea of embeddedness. Right? So ours, I would say, it is one of those embedded practices that has been committed to localizing the global, to really exposing the conditions, the social, political conditions inscribed in the territory. One of the major protagonists, primarily at a time of global warming or the return to the possibility of environmental thinking, has been to expose a series of characters as part of our work. This is what is called the binational watershed system, shared between San Diego and Tijuana, between the US and Mexico. It's called the Tijuana River Watershed System. You can see our two neighborhoods at the tip end of this huge natural hydrological system ending in the Pacific Ocean. Well, this is truncated by the border wall. So as we know, one fundamental issue here is how do we expose the conflict between imposed administrative arbitrary boundaries and natural systems. The conflict between the natural and the political, I think, is one of the major issues that is reorganizing our thinking. So if we zoom further into that territory, we find the other two characters we wanted to introduce you to in terms of our work. Two small, marginalized neighborhoods on both sides of the Tijuana-San Diego checkpoint. To the north, San Isidro, which is the first immigrant neighborhood into the US after crossing the checkpoint, and to the south, Laureles Canyon, which is what we call the last slum from Latin America, literally crashing against the border wall and home to 85,000 people, and in between, the tip end of the Tijuana River watershed, which is called the Tijuana River Estuary, which now has become overlaid with militarization after 9/11, where Homeland Security has its base. So in essence, we wanted to share with you that in less than 3-mile radius in our work, we find all imaginable registers in terms of the issues that should be the basis of reorganizing our conversation and our practices. Obviously, uneven urbanization. It's incredible to imagine that these two cities, Tijuana and San Diego, have very close to the same population, but San Diego has grown 6 times larger than Tijuana in the last years. So immediately this image exposes this sort of interesting conflict between density and sprawl. One city that has the resources to be wasteful and create this unprecedented sprawl in steroids. Dramatic inequality. In other places probably in the world, you can find some of the wealthiest zip codes, like the one found near our universities, Rancho Santa Fe, 20 minutes away from some of the poorest informal settlements of Latin America. Obviously, this polarity between enclaves of wealth and sectors of marginalization are reproduced everywhere in the world, but somehow in this border they are dramatized. Territorial militarization and surveillance, or the control, the sort of the militaristic strategies of control of the territory, which have forever been part of the construction of the city, in a sense, equating to exclusionary forms of urban policy and planning. Right? So the alliance of militarization and urbanization, the estuary itself, the Tijuana River Estuary, has become a military base. So this is a strange alliance between environmental systems and militarization. Migratory flows and the shifting demographics of every city in the world, every neighborhood. We can witness here, as much of our research is interested in the impact of immigrants in the transformation of the American neighborhood. The politics of outsourcing and cheap labor, which are everywhere out of these, obviously, international trade agreements. Tijuana, as Fonna mentioned earlier, is a city of factories, one of those tax havens that have enabled multinationals from Asia particularly to come and set shop in Tijuana to take advantage of cheap labor without investing anything really in return and avoiding regulation, right? That kind of situation. And finally, the challenges of informal urbanization. What is the meaning of this emergent informal economies and densities that are happening in every city in the world? In our context, San Isidro becomes the point of entry to understand the retrofitting of suburbia, of homogeneous suburbia in Southern California into more complex social economic systems, right? So the alteration of the large with the small. Into the south, which this is actually an example of a Victorian home from the 20s in the sort of mid-city neighborhood in San Diego, and in front of that house, an informal taco shop has been already built to sustain the economy of the inhabitants of that house. And to the south, in Laureles Canyon, we find a slum that builds itself with the waste of San Diego, recycling discarded houses, garage doors, in an urbanization which we call a kind of second-hand urbanization, right? One city builds itself with the waste of the other. So these are the dynamics that we've been interested in visualizing and documenting, the kind of emergent bottom-up flows that are invisible to the institutions, that are away from the radars of planning agencies. What role those dynamics have in transforming public policy today? And I think that our practice very much is engaged in this idea of translation, representation of some of those processes in order to really transform top-down agendas. So the vantage point here that we also wanted to share in the series of these fragments is that a more, how would I call it, a more idealized or romantic position, okay? Can we say that from the specificity of these two marginalized communities in their context, which already you see is loaded with almost every issue, can we reimagine the world from the vantage point of these marginalized communities? Can we reimagine the world's cartography? So this is where we came up with this diagram that connected our two marginalized neighborhoods, our border checkpoint, with some of the most contested checkpoints in the world. We found out that Tijuana, San Diego is in the same parallel between 30 to 35 degrees north parallels, connected to some of the most intensive checkpoints in the world. Obviously, our own border, San Diego, Tijuana, in the same necklace of geographies of conflict connected to Ceuta and Melilla, which is a main funnel of migration from North Africa into Europe, and the Israel-Palestine border. Obviously now this border has thickened in the Strait of Gibraltar as is the main hotspot for the transference or the flow of refugees and immigrants from not only North Africa, but the Middle East. We call this the political equator as a point of entry to radicalize the correspondences between local and global, but primarily to suggest that these conditions are reproduced everywhere. But in order to tackle them, we needed to bring ourselves down from the abstraction of globalization and really get to the ground, to zoom in into the specificity of the territory. So here we are at a very crucial site that we investigate, the place where the informal settlement clashes against the border wall, Homeland Security's own territory parallel to the wall, and the estuary, the environmental zone that is such a precious environmental system for the protection of the binational communities. So inserting ourselves into these environments, which means that much of our work in public space is about infiltrating in jurisdictional power, negotiating with Homeland Security to let us enter with communities to witness this environment. So we negotiated with Homeland Security to cross the border through a drain that has been recently built by Homeland Security in order to expose the interdependence between the slum and the estuary that nobody could recognize, not even the planners of both cities. So here we are crossing the border through that drain. Homeland Security told us you can do it only if Mexican immigration is waiting for you at the south end to stamp your passports. All right, so we transformed the drain into an official port of entry for 24 hours just to bring politicians, activists, students, artists, scholars, the former mayor of Medellin, Colombia, and others to witness experientially the drama of this juncture. So in essence, what emerged from here, I have many stories we would love to share with you about this performance and this sort of way of summoning different stakeholders to really perform these things. But one major issue that emerged from this performance is a fundamental question that has transformed our work in the last years. Is there such a thing as a cross-border citizen?
So the idea of citizenship then challenging conventional territorial jurisdictional definitions and thinking of citizenship more expansively as interdependence, a set of shared, aspirations, beliefs, and so forth. And our argument has always been that there are all kinds of invisible flows that move back and forth across this border: environmental flows, social and ethical flows, cultural flows, economic flows, that in many ways fly below the radar and are never fully taken into account when understanding this region. So we've been really interested to use this zone and its conflict as a way to rethink citizenship, what we mean by citizenship, which obviously has a lot of resonance for places across the world. So people today like to talk about global citizenship. We need to think of ourselves as citizens of the world, and while there's something very appealing about that from an ethical perspective, the problem with global citizenship is that it feels unrooted. It's not located anywhere. So if one is a citizenship of the world, where does one vote? Where does one participate? It's very difficult. On the other hand, localized versions of citizenship can get very insular and myopic and dug in and too narrowly tethered to identity and territory. What's interesting about our region is to open up beyond local citizenship, which is too territorial, to a more regional sense of citizenship, which is truly cross-border and transnational. A regional sense of citizenship oriented around what this region shares, regardless of the wall that arbitrarily divides these two countries. So citizenship beyond territory and identity. And for us, when looking for, experimental, more inclusive notions of citizenship, we've been inspired by case studies that have emerged from Latin American cities over the last half-centuries. Ways of thinking about collective life and public investment that have lost their voice in the US and incrementally in Europe as well during the recent years of decline in public spending, a misguided faith in austerity, the demonization of the welfare state, and the fortresses, both physical and psychological, that have been erected against the encroachment of masses who threaten to destabilize our way of life. It's from Latin America that we've really learned the most about designing civic processes that mobilize more inclusive ideas of citizenship and yield more equitable forms of urbanization in this neoliberal world of closure and uneven growth. For us, the two most powerful examples both come from Colombia, Bogota, Colombia, and soon afterward the work in Medellin, Colombia. And we've been working very closely with the leaders, the mayors primarily, of these two cities to really document the process by which these cities transformed. But let's start with Bogota and the work of Antanas Mockus in Bogota in the late 90s and early 2000s. So this was Bogota in the 90s: violence, poverty, repression, so the constant literal urban warfare on the streets between paramilitary, the military, the FARC, complete urban breakdown and chaos, essentially called the most dangerous city on the planet in the mid 80s, late 80s. Antanas Mockus was a university rector, a philosopher, actually, who became mayor of Bogota in the late 90s. And when he came, instead of guns and tanks and the conventional law and order responses to urban chaos, Mockus came with clowns and mimes and placards and an idea about how to change the hearts and minds of citizens to help them recognize and to value each other again, to regain a sense of collective urban identity. So you may know, when Antanas came into office, the very first thing he did, and people thought he was a little bit nuts, is he distributed placards to everybody, widely. Hundreds of thousands of them were distributed across the city. Basically, it was just a card with a thumb on it. And people were encouraged, as they moved through the city, to use this thumb to express social approval or disapproval of others. So if somebody did something that violated your sense of urban dignity, you would hold up a thumbs down. And if somebody did something that made you feel good about your city and collective life in your city, you'd hold a thumbs up. And everybody was kind of, strange about it at first. But it's unbelievable because slowly people began to look at each other again. Remember, this is a city in the midst of complete urban decay. People started to look at each other again and to realize that their own actions had an impact on others, and other people's actions had an impact on them, and slowly, informally, through this nonverbal gesture, they began to tacitly agree to what kind of city they wanted to live in. And slowly things began to change. They began to reconstruct what Antanas Mokus refers to as a citizenship culture. Citizenship not as a document that you carry in your wallet, but citizenship as a way of being together through tacit consent, okay, learning how to reconnect with one another. Antanas saw the city as a classroom of 7 million people. And he used that classroom to develop what has now become more ubiquitously known as tactics of urban pedagogy. As mayor of Bogota, Mokus declared emphatically from the lectern, from the municipality, the moral norms that should regulate relations among citizens, that human life is sacred, that radical inequality is unjust, that adequate education and health and the capacity to aspire are inalienable human rights, and that gender violence is intolerable, that paying one's taxes is an act of citizenship, that water conservation is. There was a whole list of them, right? He took a stand in the sense that Teddy mentioned in the earlier slides. And he developed a corresponding set of very performative gestures to demonstrate precisely what he meant. And in these performative gestures, he began to inspire generations of civic actors, urbanists, and artists across Latin America and the world to think more creatively about disrupting behavioral conventions and transforming social behavior. Now, people, when Antanas came to office, didn't think that any of these gestures would produce anything. It created sort of joint attention, and the media was watching and the cameras were rolling, and it was sort of comical, sort of humorous. But look at the results after just Antanas's first administration. He served two times. Water usage in his first 3-year term decreased by 40%. Homicide in the city of Bogota decreased by 70%. Traffic fatalities by 50%. Get this now, water and sewer services were extended to nearly all households. So this sort of bottom-up sociological approach was combined with very deliberate top-down investment in public infrastructure. So these things were working together, the top-down and the bottom-up. And tax collections nearly doubled. There's a saying that only in Latin America do mayors win elections on platforms of raising taxes. And Antanas did, and he won the election. So Teddy and I have really learned 3 important things from the Bogota example. And we've worked very closely on a variety of projects with Mokus ever since, which we'll mention in a moment. First, before transforming the city physically, and this is a very important lesson for architects and urbanists, before transforming the city physically, we must transform social norms and intervene into behavior. Second, The best way to fight urban violence is not through police repression and law and order, but through community process. Mokus was wonderful. He said, law and order doesn't interiorize new values. It just creates fearful people who do their bad stuff out of view. The goal is to internalize a new set of citizenship cultural norms. Finally, 3, that arts and culture are important agents of civic engagement, that they penetrate into the heart in ways that other kinds of interventions can't. Now, when Antanas left office, he set up a think tank in Bogota called Corpo Visionarios. And they consult municipalities across Latin America on how to cultivate citizenship culture. And every collaboration begins with what's called a citizenship culture survey. It's a very sophisticated piece of social science that the city and Corpo Visionarios design, intended to measure 2 things. It's intended to measure public trust, which is you might think of as the vertical relation between publics and institutions of power, the municipality, the church, schools, the police, and so forth. So vertical relations as well as horizontal relations, the capacity of communities to self-organize, the capacity for collective action. So they applied this survey, and then they designed very strategic interventions based on the results of this survey. So the survey becomes a script for urban intervention for the municipality, working with arts and culture organizations and community groups on the ground. So we brought Antanas to the border, and we posed the idea to him of thinking about citizenship culture in a region like ours. An idea of citizenship that isn't linked to one city or one country and the other, but a more regional sensibility that we could identify through this social science sort of experiment. And he loved it, because citizenship in his city and in many Latin American cities is always an organizing tool. It's an idea that brings people together, whereas in the US, citizenship is always a divisive tool that separates me from them, what's mine, what's theirs. So he loved the idea of rethinking citizenship in this region. It was his first US project. So we worked very closely with him, and we designed, with a whole set of stakeholders on both sides of the border, the Cross-Border Citizenship Culture Survey, which was applied to thousands of people on both sides. At the time, Teddy and I were actually leading a lab inside of the municipality in San Diego, the Civic Innovation Lab, which is another story. But because of that, we had a lot of access to our counterparts in Tijuana, and we convened civil society, universities, the private sector, and we gathered this data. We worked with the mayors. Here's the mayor of Tijuana. And we presented these results publicly. And we can talk more about the results later. But what they indicated, and what we had always known, but now had the proof to actually take to legislators, to take to policymakers, is that these publics want to collaborate on a variety of issues, but don't have the infrastructure, both at the municipal formal level or in civil society at the informal level, to carry out these collaborative projects. And so this was a very powerful weapon for those of us who are trying to argue for more cross-border collaboration. In the end, the survey becomes a mirror, a kind of mirror of self-knowledge to show these communities who they are collectively. And in that sense, it's been a very important tool for mobilizing creative interventions since.
And we're in the process of packaging right now the results and visualizing them to make them available to the institutions that collaborated. And so this couldn't be the best time, to really declare this aspect of cross-border collaboration at a moment when the border is going to close even more. Quickly, because we are running out of time, but the Medellin model becomes the second part of this story, which is fundamental. Another yet visionary mayor. That in itself is an interesting story about all these Latin American cities, many of these mayors that really came to transform the political itself and the city, by consequence, into a more socially just and inclusive environment, all of them came from academia, so it's like for us was a validation that maybe from within the university we could bring the complexity of our thinking into the reorganization of bureaucracy. And so Sergio Fajardo, a mathematician, decided to follow in a way the steps of Antanas Mockus and became mayor of Medellin. For us, Medellin becomes the pinnacle, the kind of most exemplary model, because this is where Antanas Mockus's experiments into citizenship culture, intervention, into changing, transforming the hearts and minds of people, behavioral aspects and so on, was physicalized in Medellin. So Medellin is really about the spatialization of citizenship, but also because they had the courage. This is another thing. These politicians call it for what it is. They were able to name the problem. And Sergio Fajardo, being the mayor of the most dangerous city in the world in the mid-90s, right, like Medellin, Colombia, because of the drug cartels, he said, he declared that the root of violence is inequality, and that inequality needed to be confronted as a cross-sector, cross-institutional project. Let's imagine a kind of Medellin New Deal of sorts, in an unprecedented political project that would open up governance to make it more inclusive, more collaborative, and more transparent of the bottom up, to really solve these problems together. There is no time to really go in detail about this, but many of you know that Medellin, which was divided between poor and rich, the gray here is the poor zones, no other city in the world intervened in some of the the poorest neighborhoods in the city with robust infrastructure of public spaces and transportation. There is no other place in the world where, again, cross-institutional investment occurred in those most marginalized zones in the city, with cable cars, gondolas that connected to the metro of the city to have access to these otherwise inaccessible environments, library parks, schools, places, platforms to incentivize informal economy, a huge reorganization of the centrality, let's say, of urban development that is now in collaboration with communities to rethink the city from its periphery. This was a huge concept in a way. But many of you know the physical projects really that have been published everywhere, and at some point Fonna and I were thinking, well, we were getting annoyed that all the architects were saying, well, we did it. The beautiful buildings did it. We said, no, wait a minute. And this is something that Sergio Fajardo was so adamant about. This was not an architectural project to begin with. This was not an urban project to begin with. Obviously, architecture and smart urbanism came to the rescue. But it was first a political project, he says, in reorganizing the institutions. And so Fonna and I began to collaborate with him and his urban director, Alejandro Echeverri, to begin a project of visualization that would trace some of the most compelling concepts that enable this urban transformation. So we call it the Medellin diagram. It's another project we've been working with, but we wanted to share it with you because in this context, we are interested on the idea of, again, translation and being interlocutors of that institutional memory. So we interviewed 40 plus people that were part of the urban process to really understand the actors and the stakeholders that had really played a role in this transformation, because it was truly a top-down and bottom-up agenda. There is no time to really show that this is our main sort of point of entry table, but we pretty much defined three major areas in the transformation of Medellin. One was the reconstruction of the political and of bureaucracy. We call it confronting inequality as a cross-sector mutual responsibility, convening a new civic conversation. Sergio Fajardo, the first thing he did was to call 50 people from representing really all sectors in the city to come to his office, transforming his office into an urban think tank, which is, there are so many issues about that are beautiful, but procedurally speaking, but it's a long story. The second area, which we are interested very much about, is that they said, well, our first site of intervention is the most marginalized zones where so much violence has occurred because we've withdrawn from there, and we want to re-engage them with a new project of public investment, we first have to redesign our own stupid bureaucracy. And so they redesign governance, and that implies producing new agencies that were tasked to mediate and to coordinate what had been fragmented, et cetera. And finally, a project of spatialization of citizenship, that's the way we called it, in the physicalization of public space as a space of knowledge. Again, because our time is disappearing, some of these notions we are trying to animate and visualize. We're still working on it. We have an exhibition in San Francisco in 2 months, so we are in the midst of it. But one concept, for example, is the capacity of Medellin to have produced a project of mediation between top-down and bottom-up. And I think that more we see it is one of the most important issues today. Who is going to be mediating the interface between formal and informal institutions? So it's almost as if mediation could be designed, and this is what they did. They were designing intermediary spaces of comprehension, they call them, primarily to task new agencies in the redistribution of surplus value or the profits of urbanization into public projects or public sort of socially engaged projects. Again, much to say about this, but one major thing that they did was to really look at the chart of bureaucracy and completely shatter it down, or at least reorganize it. This is what Fonna and I were trying to do in San Diego with our own mayor. I mean, how is the structure of government really designed, right? Who reports to who, the mayor, the community, how can the community participate, et cetera. It's a difficult thing to talk about in rough, kind of impressionistic terms. One thing about Medellin is that as they redistribute surplus value, something that we got actually very sad about Medellin, because we realized that we couldn't really take those ideas to our own site of conflict, is that Medellin, different to many other cities in the world, owns its own resources. So Medellin owns water, telecommunication, and energy. And 40% of the dividends are poured back into public infrastructure. Okay, so for many Americans, that would sound like communism. Maybe you are more aware of that here. But in other words, this is another story about how we should not privatize or swallow the pill, right? That we need to privatize public assets because public is inefficient and so on. Quickly, another point here is an incredible process of summoning, integrating the fragmented knowledges and resources of institutions. Huge. In essence, universities, civic philanthropy, private industry, government, grassroots organizations convened in order to share the resources and knowledges, only then to be redistributed in a visionary way to contact sectors of marginalization and poverty. So this is what we ended up calling as a concept the simultaneous centralization and decentralization of knowledges and resources. Another one, fundamental, but time is escaping. No, I think we still have a couple of minutes. Let's just finish up here. Public space educates. How much time do we have? In our clock, we have 5 more minutes, right? Very, very important here. Public space educates, okay, as a concept in Medellin, which has been the axis of our work recently. They saw public space not just as a space of beautification, as a physical space that can be beautiful, but is not inclusive. So they first began with a cross-curatorial project, again, summoning all these institutions in a project that they declared to be a project of mutual responsibility. Not only government is going to pay for it, but private, all of us need to pay for it. And again, public space is not just physical, but it needs to be injected with smart social, economic, and cultural programming, co-curated with communities. So it's a beautiful example of how the physical and the systems of management, economically and culturally, collaboratively, can be produced in order to sustain those spaces in the long term. Obviously, this is what resulted into the library parks project. I can run very quickly through this. The last project is the cross-border community stations. I think we should you're right, maybe we should skip this, which is a project finally of intervention for us, because basically we began a project that links our own university with the marginalized communities we introduced you to, in a project that is called the Cross-Border Community Stations. And it's basically a project that links the creative intelligence of communities, their issues, their aspirations, with the specialized knowledge of the university in a kind of circulation or exchange of resources and knowledges. So communities co-produce with us curriculum for the university. And as you said it very well in the introduction about Metrolab, we're interested not only in connecting to the university in a more meaningful way, but also bringing the activists of the communities to enable the rethinking of educational and research protocols. So we have founded 3 stations in many of the neighborhoods that we shared with you, so that researchers, students, activists, residents, the NGOs we work with, and the university, we produce a collaborative education and research project. But also, just to end very quickly, it really has become the most beautiful opportunity to produce a shared urban intervention. We claim that communities and universities can be co-developers of new public spaces that educate, a la Medellin. So we have gotten, because of our alliance, we have gotten land. I mean, this is EarthLab in collaboration with the social environmental justice nonprofit. We have gotten land, for example, in this case, from the school district of San Diego, 4 acres, right? So we all of a sudden have land, have power, and we are going to transform this into a 4-acre open-air environmental classroom to incentivize climate action at the bottom-up scales. And in the other 2 stations, in San Isidro and Laureles, in collaboration with Casa Familiar, we are basically engaging housing in San Isidro with Casa Familiar, so our station is pretty much the epicenter as a public space. It's a neighborhood cultural incubator that co-produces programming with us and the community and the residents. But what is interesting about this is that this one becomes the epicenter for the development of affordable housing in a kind of model that links housing with public space. And in Laureles Canyon, we really went too much, but we are basically negotiating land with the municipality of Tijuana in this informal settlement to produce a series of public spaces. But primarily, our community station there becomes a kind of temporal infrastructure that can be inserted with clinics, arts, and public sort of event spaces, spaces for the scientists who are part of our university, who work with communities to measure dynamics within the informal settlement, and a variety of storage, let's say energy systems, solar and water, and spaces for residency for artists who really are social practitioners, who engage communities in the co-production also of knowledge, a small black box theater. In essence, can architecture become a pedagogical tool in these environments, rendering transparent these socioeconomic, environmental, and cultural relations? And so this is a vertical station in Laureles.
Can we do the conclusion? Can we have three minutes? Okay, 2 minutes, all right. Well, we wanted to show you a cross-section of our practice, the way we've been engaging more inclusive dynamics in our region. But we'd like to end reflecting on the central question of the seminar this week at Metrolab, which is this idea of hospitality, and how essential hospitality is as a first gesture when encountering the dynamics we're seeing right now, the global migratory flows and so forth. But the question is how then to move beyond hospitality to create equitable outcomes that are long-term and sustainable. The idea then that the guest, right, who receives hospitable treatment when he or she arrives is then integrated into the city, the future of the city, participating in its evolution over time. So our argument is that cities need to welcome their own evolution and their own the outcomes of participatory democracy. which will evolve over time as new demographics arrive. So hospitality also needs a longer vision to imagine inclusion over time. And in these last minutes, we'd like to offer a set of very brief provocations that can enable us to think about hospitality, but also how to move beyond it, understanding that this moment of dramatic influx requires a longer-term vision. Let's imagine a bottom-up public, a set of informal adaptations that counter the imposition of exclusionary political and economic power, from the everyday acts of survival and adaptation in migrant communities everywhere to our own artistic and activist practices on the ground. Let's design a more stealthful urbanization to challenge the wave of anti-immigrant, anti-public assaults that have descended upon us. What can this bottom-up public look like? Here are a couple of elements. First, enough preaching to the choir. Chances are most of us in this room agree on essential principles of inclusion and social equity. But how do we engage those who don't? We need to infiltrate cultures of opposition, understand their logics of justification, and decode this new Orwellian social reality. Events like this one feel great, but we need to get uncomfortable with consensus. We need to instigate conflict, instigate questions. We can't underestimate the depth of opposition or be blindsided anymore. We need to retool ourselves. Second, as we said, we need to intervene into social norms and create new social and behavioral expectations of inclusion and social equity from the bottom up, and shame people. Let's not be afraid to shame people who violate the norms of inclusion. Let's use arts and culture to do it. We need a new citizenship culture that transcends us versus them. Let's untether citizenship from the territorial and identitarian obsession with borders and boundaries. Next, we need to mediate interface. In our practice, we believe that top-down and bottom-up resources and knowledges need to meet, and we need agencies who are skilled in carrying out this mediation. We need to be translators, alternative political representatives in many ways, who can communicate to the policymakers the needs and aspirations of marginalized groups, which are too often homogenized and set off of the radar. Teddy.
And all of this needs to translate into a new language of urban rights. For example, socializing density. Density can no longer be measured as an abstract amount of objects per acre, but as an amount of social and economic exchanges per acre. The small social and economic contingencies of informal urbanization will transform the largeness of selfish sprawl into a more sustainable, plural, and complex environments. Zoning has to stop being a punitive tool to prevent socialization. Zoning needs to be a generative tool to reorganize activity and economy at community scales. Temporalizing space, we need to challenge the autonomy of buildings, often conceived as self-referential objects that are indifferent to social and economic temporalities embedded in the city. How to engage instead the complex temporalization of space found in informal urbanization's management of time, people, spaces, and resources, as the informal is not just an image, the informal is a praxis. Rethinking property. We need to rethink existing models of property by redefining affordability through the value of social participation. We need to elevate the role of communities in co-producing housing, enabling a more inclusive idea of ownership while protecting a community's right to social and economic sustainability. Redistributing knowledges. This is a crisis of knowledge transference. Our inability to translate and politically represent bottom-up knowledge to transform top-down policy. Social justice today cannot be only about the redistribution of resources, but about the redistribution of knowledges. Democratizing access. The most emblematic image during the civil rights movement, at least for us in the United States, was when Rosa Parks sat in the seat where she did not belong. Even though the bus was public, it was inaccessible to many. Today, we need to move from the neutrality of the public to the specificity of rights, the social and economic rights of communities to benefit from the profits of urbanization.
And finally, the last point is that public space must educate. For us, all the elements we just mentioned converged in the urgency to transform public space. Let's reject conventional strategies of urban beautification and innovation that turn our public spaces into exclusive sites of leisure and consumption. Let's question the agendas of new urbanism and creative class pop-ups. Usually they only accelerate gentrification, cynically appropriate arts and culture, commodify multiculturalism to enrich private developers, and become an apology for the absence of more substantial public investment. No, public space must educate. Public space must be the site of hospitality, of debate, of contestation, and infused with resources and tools that increase public knowledge, ethical commitment, and cultivate community capacity for political action.
Thank you. Sorry for the long